In this section, we'll discuss assessment challenges when working with deaf and hard of hearing individuals. Substance abuse assessment and screening tools are normed for individuals who are hearing and thus may not be appropriate for deaf and hard of hearing individuals. Typically, substance abuse assessors have limited access and experience working with deaf individuals. They work with hearing individuals who depend heavily on the English-based tests they take, either from the computer or the forms that they fill out. Most assessors don't have a lot of experience with deaf individuals. I've experienced a situation where a deaf client had to write back and forth with an assessor because there was no interpreter. The assessor then based the client's treatment on those notes they had written back and forth. Other situations, because an assessor is unfamiliar with how to use an interpreter, once an interpreter is introduced, there may be an impact that's negative. The interpreter may not have training in substance abuse terminology, or maybe is not familiar with the concepts that will be discussed. In rural areas, it's very difficult to find interpreters who are trained in that area. It's important to remember when you hire an interpreter, it changes the climate or the atmosphere because of the third party being involved. Even if the assessor and the deaf client are accustomed to working with interpreters, it still changes the environment because there's a third person, and there's an impact on that deaf person. The assessor might be skilled in working with this client, but might be unaware of deaf culture, and therefore if a problem arises that's related to deaf culture, they may misunderstand that and think it's related to a substance abuse issue, when really it's not. It's important to develop a shared understanding and meaning of the terminology and concept. Simply signing withdrawal or tolerance or blackout without a shared understanding of meaning may not produce reliable or valid results. The relationship between the assessor and the deaf individual is very important, but often is difficult through a third party, such as the interpreter. And so sometimes even having an interpreter can be ineffective. And some of you may not have in-depth training in regards to assessment and using assessment tools. And maybe you're working with clients or students that you're thinking might have a problem, but you don't know. If you use some of the screenings, such as the ones we're going to discuss today, it might give you a better idea of how to refer a particular student or client for treatment or placement. The first one we're going to talk about today is the cage, and it has 4 questions for you to ask your client or student. The first question is, have you ever tried to cut down or reduce the amount you drink? The second, do you ever get angry or annoyed when people criticize your drinking? The third, do you ever feel guilty about your drinking? So for example, say you've tried to stop or cut down on your drinking and have not been able to do so. Has that resulted in a feeling of guilt because of that? And the fourth, do you have an eye opener, which is a drink in the morning to relieve a hangover or withdrawal symptoms? Based on their answers, you tally them and compare them to the following chart. If there is 0 correct, the likelihood of being an alcoholic is less than 1. If 1 is correct, it's 1.5 times more likely that they're an alcoholic. If 2 are correct, it's 4.5 times more likely that that person will be an alcoholic. If 3 correct, 13 times more likely. And if 4 correct, 100 times more likely that that person would be an alcoholic than a non-alcoholic. This screening is a great tool to use when you work with a student or client who you think might have a problem, and will help you refer them to appropriate placement and again, not diagnose them. When you first meet with your client or student, you might want to think about adding these questions, just to see if maybe there is an issue that they have. And I'm going to be talking about 2 brand new ASL screening tools for substance abuse. They're currently being developed, and they will be available for your use very soon. The first one is called the Substance Abuse Screener American Sign Language, the SAS-ASL. The second is called the Global Appraisal of Individual Needs Short Screener, which is also referred to as the GAIN. The SAS-ASL is actually developed through the Research and Training Center on Disability and Vocational Rehabilitation at Wright State University in Ohio. They had worked with the SASE Institute and adapted the SASE 3, the Specific Substance Abuse Subtle Screening Inventory, for consumers who worked within vocational rehabilitation. They had about 1,000 consumers spread out through 3 different states, and they tested this screener. This did not include deaf and hard of hearing people because we had gotten grant funding to create a separate screener using ASL specifically for deaf and hard of hearing individuals. At the California School for the Deaf, we established a committee made up of 5 individuals who were willing to be on the linguistics committee. This staff looked at 75 questions and translated them into ASL. So what they did was take each English question and find the ASL equivalent. We made a CD-ROM of those questions and translations, and following a yes or no format for all questions, we sent them out in the ASL version and asked people to write an English translation to check for cross-translation to make sure that everything was correct, and we asked for feedback. That took time, actually more than 1 year, and as we received the feedback, we reduced the questions to 30 from 75. It takes about 12 to 14 minutes to complete this. It will be available for all of you to use at the end of 2010. That'll tell you a lot of different characteristics about their use. For example, it has a lie indicator, which will show you if a person is not being truthful in their answers. You'll get a paperback with the results of the screening, which include client characteristics. Additional information and resources will be available on their website. The second tool is called the GAIN Short Screener, which is used with general populations. Many agencies use this to identify people who might have a behavioral disorder. For example, psychiatric disorders or possibly an issue with violence. If you use the full screening tool, it'll take over an hour to complete, but if you use the short screener that we are now developing with 20 questions, it takes much less time and has a lot of great information. We received funding to develop an ASL version of the GAIN. So again, in collaboration with California School for the Deaf at Fremont, we formed a translation committee made up of 3 deaf staff counselors who got together to take a look at the English version of the test and translate it into ASL. We had several meetings to work on the translation. And now we're producing videotapes that will show the ASL version for each question that will then be sent out. And during the first part of this process, we will solicit feedback or back translation responses from volunteer evaluators. And once we collect those responses and determine the necessary revisions to the signed items, then we will make new video clips as necessary and compile pre-pilot and post-pilot versions of the test instrument. We will then collect that feedback, and at the end of that, we'll make new video clips as necessary and compile a pilot test version of the instrument and that should be ready at the end of the year, so it's very exciting that finally we will have access to screening tools in ASL that many of us will be able to benefit from in our line of work. Thank you.